welcome back from break. And so we're ready to open the second segment of our second day forum. We have Kristi Chen from Sculpture Installations graduating, waiting to present her project entitled To Retrieve a Possible Heirloom. Kristi, are you ready to share your screen?
Yes, I am.
Yes, hi. Yeah.
Hi. Okay, just give me one moment here.
Thank you.
Oh.
People are returning, so we just can slowly start.
Okay. Oh. Okay, there we go. Okay, just give me one moment. I'm just gonna put it in full screen or slideshow. Okay.
Cool.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristi Chen. I'm an interdisciplinary artist based in Toronto and a recent OCAD graduate from the Sculpture Installation program. And I would like to present my recent body of work called To Retrieve a Possible Heirloom. And so an heirloom, a memento to keep a legacy alive, passed down from one generation to another through words and objects. These are the gestures that provide us historical archives to carry knowledge. And nevertheless, with immigration, mass industrialization, colonialism, hierarchical structures, and technological advancements have disrupted many individuals' abilities to pass down certain legacies and narratives. A product of my ancestors, this has left me to wonder, how does one retrieve the loss of intergenerational knowledge and create a possible heirloom? Okay, so it kind of all started with a basket, a carrier of not only items, but a carrier of narratives, culture, and systems bestowed from our predecessors. I got this quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, the author of The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And she stated, before you know it, the men and the women in the wild oat patch and their kids, etc., are all part of it. Have been all pressed into the service in the tale of the hero, but it isn't their story, it's his. And when I read this quote, I just thought of the carrier as an entanglement of narratives, both good and messy, with no heroes or victories. And it's more of a system, the carrier is more of a system of storytelling and the passing of intergenerational knowledge that provides our culture, landscape, history, and identity. The skill of basketry tells a familial story, a craft practice slowly diminishing in the hands of our contemporary world. In the scope of the modern era and COVID-19, the ways of retrieving knowledge contrast against the traditions of learning from an elder. Thus, with no weavers in my immediate family, this has eluded me towards digital platforms such as YouTube and Vimeo, simultaneously creating and learning basketry. Next slide. Yeah, so I started learning basketry, and it started with the research of this work called Basket Blighted. And this was a triptych variation of gourd-like handmade baskets that convey the loss of intergenerational knowledge and narratives. The increase of global migration and mass production has resulted in basketry slowly dwindling away in my father's hometown of hometown of Shoning, Fujian, a village that is slowly transforming into a bustling town. As the advancement of technology increases, labor-intensive practices such as basketry are less appealing to obtain. Botanist Robin Wall Kamara indicates how members of the community believe that the prices of birch bark baskets should justify the craft and labor intrinsic to their making. People, and she stated in this quote from Braiding Sweetgrass, was from the chapter of the Black Ash Basket. And she said that people think it's just basket weaving, but 80% of the work comes long before you weave. With finding the tree, pounding and pulling at the birch bark and all, you barely make minimum wage. This spoke to me as the whole process of learning this craft tradition of sourcing nature was a little ironic. I would start purchasing ready-made reeds from Commonwealth baskets and other ready-made objects to juxtapose the concept of using your own resources to create materials. And with the research process of Basket Blighted, the forms of this work is different from traditional basket scene in my father's village. So I mentioned Laufer that there is a big difference between baskets in northern China and compared to the baskets in the south. The southern regions have more gilded decorations. As you can see in the bottom of the presentation, these are baskets from the Fujian province back in the 18th century. And so Laufer says that in the southern regions had more gilded decorations with crafted handles for storing delicate plants like flowers and tea leaves. And the northern regions of China had rugged terrain, so therefore the baskets are more durable for harsher climates and agricultural work. So my father's village is located in the regions of southern China, specifically Fujian province. And these images of these handcrafted baskets allowed me to see the origins of the traditional structures, forms, and shapes. And this kind of drove me to think about what would these baskets sort of look like in the age of digital media, synthetics, and hybridity in the kind of, I guess, era that we live in the present times. So Basket Blighted is not really intended to master or mimic the works of Fujian style baskets. The installation touches upon the conversations of my making using ancestral and digital archives. Using silicone, incense paste, and a tomato planter, unorthodox methods of combining basketry with other materials was a way of communicating the complexity of identities, systems, and landscapes we see in our present world. The forms of this basket blighted are organic, non-functional, and gourd-like, in contrast to the traditional utilitarian baskets from my father's village. Okay. And so this is my great grandfather. And I wanted to continue the concept of the basket carrier containing narratives and pieces of knowledge to kind of like use the basket weaving to mend different ideologies together. As this is a familial body of work that I'm sort of researching. My paternal research started to connect with my maternal ancestors. So my great-grandfather on the right-hand side, Ho Chat Yun, was a Lingnan style Chinese painter, and he was born in 1888 and passed away in 1970. He's lived through a lifetime of success and turmoil, and his intentions with his work is to synthesize the East and West, blending the old and new, and Ho tirelessly enriching traditions by merging Western principles and real landscape themes. This made me start to kind of question, why is the West a source of innovation? Kind of his work started to prompt me into making this work called The Stag in the Pool. So I was inspired by his work called White Deer Under Autumn Leaves, and it was one of Ho's paintings that prompted me towards a scene of the fable by Aesop called The Stag in the Pool. So there was one part of the fable where the deer is looking at its own reflection in the pond, and the deer wading in water in Ho's painting seemed like two visual tropes that could manifest into an installation. The idea of weaving the deer with reeds stems from Basket Blighted, with the previous research that I did before. And using this basketry in a way of communicating narratives rather than the utilitarian functional objects that you would see in regular baskets. The woven deer is a metaphor for survival in the context of collaboration. And I took a quote from Anne Sing, and the book was called The Mushroom at the End of the World. And she says that collaboration means working across differences, which leads to contamination, but without collaboration, we would all die. And not honing Ho's masterful skill of Chinese watercolor, and instead of using sculpture and installation can be considered a contamination to his legacy for some. As his great-granddaughter, my experiences and environment were very much different from my great-grandfather's. Therefore, there's no need or point to replicate his skills or work, as we are two different entities that happen to be in the same lineage. And for me, I think that just the collaboration with him is just for me to just keep his narrative alive and just to sustain his legacy. Just gonna go back to this, and with my development of the project to retrieve a possible heirloom, I started to analyze the question of whether the introduction of Western perspectives represents innovation was an interesting proposition. In our digital age, innovation is now fabricated through technology and artificial intelligence. In my great-grandfather's era, living through 2 world wars and after, the West had a great amount of influence on many countries, including China and Hong Kong, due to colonization. At the same time, the great power that the Western world holds has shaped many societies around the world to view the adoption of Eurocentric methods as the start of something new. As his great-grandfather, however, I don't necessarily view innovation to correlate with the West. To me, innovation sometimes involves seeking to the past to look forward, using the resources around me and my experiences. After thinking about what it means to devise for innovation, the concept of technology, synthetics, and hybridity interested me to further collaborate with my great-grandfather. 9 Fishes is an observational painting based on a small school of koi fish created by my great-grandfather, inspired by the Pepto-Bismol. So previously in the previous project, I made a Pepto-Bismol pothole and I wanted to explore it a little bit more. So the pink pothole in the installation was a commentary on our Anthropocene landscape and ecological footprint that has created these strange, bizarre environments that are no longer natural. And the reason why I made this pool was because initially I actually did a piece on a pothole. I actually forgot to put the image on the presentation, so I'm really sorry about that. But the reason why I made this pool was because I was showing at a gallery space and I really wanted to show sort of this like dystopic natural environment. So this kind of prompted me to create this artificial koi pond. And while I was sort of fabricating this work called 9 Fishes, it sort of helped emphasize the concept of computerized technology, such as using a CNC router to build the structure. With the addition of battery-powered fish, 9 Fishes reflects on our present-day landscape. And I took a quote from an essay by Mining, and he describes as, "Landscape is related to, but not identical with nature. The idea of landscape runs counter to the recognition of any simple binary relationship between culture and nature." And the pond shape was by computerized drawing, and I had digital robotic fish eerily tapping against the structure, and the foamy layer of water are all elements of our human behavior altering our natural environments and bodies. So I'm just gonna play the video. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the liquid, the pink Pepto-Bismol liquid a little bit. So I decided to use that in this work because I feel that the water systems in our world right now is not necessarily the same as maybe in the past of where my great-grandfather drew this beautiful koi pond. I was kind of imagining a more sort of dystopic ways of how our environment is, especially in the present day. I was kind of influenced by uh, some videos that I've seen of the people whaling or killing whales and seeing this just pink pool of blood all over the water. And I just thought that was really dystopic and really interesting, because that kind of speaks to like our present day of maybe like overfishing and over like whaling. And I just thought the Pepto-Bismol would be a really interesting way to represent that. And it's also like a stomach medicine. So there's that sort of like discomfort with, yeah, there's that sort of like discomfort between like maybe the humans and like the natural environment. So that's kind of the reason why I use the Pepto-Bismol for the pool. And just in summary of like the whole project, I felt that the journey of this humble basket kind of manifested into a plethora of familial and historical archives that have made many variations of a possible heirloom. Exploring both my maternal and paternal side of my family has revealed a loss of intergenerational knowledge. However, they also showed strength. The narratives passed down to me about my father's baskets, weaving experiences, and my great-grandfather's resilience in his art career motivated me to create possibilities. During this time of COVID-19, there were many unconventional ways of receiving archives, and the limitations drove me to create a work and process that is unorthodox. Researching and analyzing my ancestors made me more aware of how different perspectives is in comparison to them. This has allowed me to be more transparent by stating my works that are not intended to be mastered or mimicked or replicated by the archives. With so many paintings, images, and readings that I may or may not have discovered yet, leaves room for the potential to continue sharing the knowledge of my ancestors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, that was so inspiring and enriching. Can we maybe stop sharing the video, the images, so we can have a face-to-face?
Yeah.
So on request, we can show the slide as well. There are so much, my goodness, it was beautiful artwork, as well as a very intellectually enriching as well. So let's open up the discussion. Anyone who has a questions and comments, raise your hands. Yep, Aaron, you can go first, and then please yeah, use your chat rooms if you like, or so we can retrieve that comments as well for.
Thank you.
Amy and Beth, yes.
So I was wondering, because you mentioned innovation being tied to like Western ideology, and then you referenced Hong Kong as well. I was wondering, because Hong Kong after colonization kind of became like a financial hub, right? That's how like money goes around Asia, and then because of that, things are becoming more and more expensive. So it seems like the innovation in that context has more to do with like capitalism than that. It's more than just Westernization, but also capitalism. You kind of do a kind of satirical comments on that with like the Pepto-Bismol, right?
Yeah.
It's like a pool of that. So I wonder, I just wondering if you could comment on that a little bit more.
Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, you definitely like hit the point on that. I definitely was like kind of influenced by the capitalist too, because I mean, I did use digital media to learn this kind of stuff, and digital media is kind of part of that whole capitalist system. And I did mention that like the reed that I use for my baskets, they're not like, I didn't like chop down a tree and like pull it down myself. I actually just bought the ready-made stuff. So I think that kind of relationship is really interesting, that like I'm using all these ready-made objects to do this tradition, but I'm not learning it in the traditional way or process. And it's just, yeah, in like a time like this as well with COVID-19 and not being able to see my family, like it was just like, these were just the resources that I just had. And just living in Toronto, where basketry is not like a very common practice, I felt like, you know, maybe doing it in this unorthodox way was would be an interesting kind of way to I guess achieve like this body of work.
So both are Hong Kong, has a Hong Kong heritages. So you are, yeah, speaking about that, it's on point, about innovation in general and tradition. Okay, Jamie, you can go ahead, and there are a lot of comments to be followed.
Since this is like you reconnecting with your parent generation and even the generations before, I wanted to know how your parents might have reacted to the basketry you made.
That's a really good question, because I felt like my family was actually pretty involved in this. I had a lot of conversations with my father. Like, he would tell really interesting stories. Like, so like my father actually doesn't know how to weave baskets. It was only like his great grandparents who know how to do it, and maybe my grandfather. And I think the biggest reason why is because of, like, you know, the globalization that was happening in China. Like, my dad in middle school, he took a lot of like exams, and like he did really well. So the thing was, like, it's either you take the exam and you can excel, or you become a basket weaver in your village and you might not make as much. So yeah, my dad was telling me, like, oh, you know, I left the village at a very young age because in middle school I had to go to a different province and stuff like that. So a lot of it was just a lot of migration that was happening in his lifetime that sort of like made the loss of his own traditional knowledges of weaving. So I thought that kind of story was really interesting. And I just thought that the baskets in his provinces were really beautiful. And I just really wanted to sort of do the basketry, but do it in kind of like my way too. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting conversation. I have a question or comments. I'm not just an art historian, but I have art historian question. We have more questions are waiting. So what I found interesting that it didn't occur in my mind before was that you actually presented this basket, is very sculptural form as a part of sculptural installation, which could have been quite a surprise to many of your professors or department committee in general. So I think that was great victories of, you know, you in a way twisted the idea of ready-made that typically from the, you know, history of martial design is modern mass-produced industrial objects presented as art and meant to ask question what art is. And now you are actually presenting ready-made, which I wasn't clear whether to what extent you transformed it, but are you saying that you didn't transform it at all? You just bought it and just placed it in the context of exhibition. I just want to clarify as a factual information. So anyway, that was quite interesting aspect. And then let me just reserve another question for after other comments. Yeah, I just want to clarify the factual one if you can. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. These forms that I use, they are ready made. So I've kind of just found them in like places where people throw out furniture and stuff. And I usually would take them and manipulate the forms and make it into something a little bit different.
That's right, you did. Yes. Yeah. So you did manipulate a little bit. So it is more than the ready made. Yeah.
For sure, yeah. I'll manipulate it, but then still try and like keep the form so people recognize it's a tomato planter, but it's like not really because it's like a different shapes a little bit. So yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Maari and Melly, right? Am I correct in terms of order?
Yeah, I think so. If that's okay with you.
Marley.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation, Kristi. That was fantastic. I was just like in awe the whole entire time, but maybe I have some more comments and questions, but I really enjoy this essence of reweaving kind of a history with hybrid modernity. I think that's so special, and sort of recreating these like hybrid heirlooms that are personal to you and your kind of exposure with intergenerational gaps, but also this this connection to history and your family's traditions. So was so fascinating to me, and something that I kind of touch on in my work. So I was really enjoyed sort of hearing you talk about that. But the pink pool was so amazing and made me think about Donna Haraway's sort of cyborg manifesto. And it really kind of translated to me as this almost primordial ooze that became synthetic and almost like radioactive in the color, and but also an essence of delicacy and intimacy with the fish and the watercolor painting. So that was just fantastic and very conceptually driven, which I appreciated. And I guess I was wondering if you feel as though you've created your own heirlooms in this way, something that could be passed on. And I don't know, I see them as like a collection of your own personal sort of things that you could pass on in the future.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I kind of feel like I did sort of create my own heirloom because, like I said in my work, I don't really intend to mimic these paintings or replicate them exactly. I kind of wanted to sort of be inspired by them, or yeah, I take inspiration from it and sort of do in the context of what I've kind of experienced and what I see now, and like maybe in the contemporary world that we live in. And yeah, when you mentioned Donna Haraway, actually, I was kind of like, yeah, sort of inspired by that sort of like cyborg futurism, and like, yeah, even with like Liebel as well, and her sort of cyborg works as well. So that kind of sort of prompted me to do like that sort of CNC computerized structure, and yeah, like all the stuff that you sort of mentioned really kind of fit in with what I was trying to like express. And yeah, with the work that you've done too, I can definitely relate to yours because it's so ancestral. So yeah.
Interesting. I will talk more, but yeah, there's almost this sort of symbiosis that you've created between your sort of exposures and this history. So I really appreciate it. And yes, definitely the Cyborg Manifesto for sure. Thanks so much.
No problem.
I was taken by the stomach medicine choice a lot too. Yeah, let me just, Malis, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your presentation. It was, yeah, really interesting indeed. And I just had a comment, especially when you precise that your father, since he succeeded in this exam, I think it's like the national exam for China, right? Yeah. Since he succeeded, he didn't become a weaver like your grandfather and your great-grandfathers. Yeah, and I thought it was very interesting for you as the great-granddaughter / granddaughter of like basket weavers to go back on your roots, because I know that nowadays a lot of Chinese families, and especially in the countryside, really put a lot of effort into their children's education so that they can actually leave the countryside. And well, as good as it may be, I guess, in many ways, it also comes with a loss in provincial and national traditions and traditional crafts. So yeah, I thought it was generations after. I just thought it was very interesting, and I mean it's double. I don't remember how it's called, but it comes with costs and benefits, right? To like put everything in education and like modern education nowadays.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with what you're saying, especially in this like modern context that we were talking about, even with craft as well. I remember I was talking to my textiles teacher, and she was saying that more and more students don't know how to knit and sew because like, yeah, it's something that like, I guess it's like laborious, takes too much time, and like, it's just like too traditional, I guess. It's not, I guess,
you can just give you can just give that kind of work to somebody else, and like nowadays it's not done as much as it used to be, and yeah, it's a loss in material work, right? Like I don't know, it's a bit sad sometimes. I feel like it's just but well.
But maybe like hoping that like when we take these traditions back, that could be like the way we could see the future too. Maybe reclaiming these traditions. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, thank you.
I think Zahid had a question, because I see in the comments that he tried to raise his hand and wasn't able to.
Oh
yeah, we'll get.
Yeah, who is the next?
We'll get Abneet first, and then Zahid, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Kristi. Thanks for your presentation. I don't know if this is more of a comment maybe than a question. I'm just thinking about how in the West, there's this history of basket weaving and things like that not being considered art. and instead they're considered like craft, which is like separate from art. And a lot of the times this distinction ends up being gendered as well, because craft ends up being associated with women. And because your baskets are non-utilitarian, and because you've spoken to this history of like your grandfather and like men engaging in basket weaving and things like that, you seem to be kind of critiquing both of those like beliefs and assumptions. And I'm wondering if that's something that you're consciously engaging with, or if that's something you don't even feel the need to respond to because it's not like culturally relevant, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really good comment that you've actually mentioned about the how craft is sort of like related to femininity, and talking about my great grandfather having that like masculine figure and me being like a female doing this type of work. I think for me, it's I think now we live in this like present day now that we don't have as much of that sort of like hierarchical like gender sort of I guess like issue where like, oh, the male's like definitely the one that is the leader, and then the females are the one who are more submissive and they do more of the craft sort of thing. And yeah, I think I don't intentionally thought of like making that comment, but I think my work definitely says that for sure. Seeing that like intergenerational gap from my great grandfather and then having the great granddaughter to do it is a little bit like, and it's also an Orthodox too, maybe. So, so yeah, I think that was a really good observation. And yeah, definitely, I would think that even though I didn't state it, I would say that yes, it definitely has that sort of correlation as well with, yeah, with the craft being the feminine sort of work, and then my great grandfather having that masculine sort of trajectory on, I guess, paintings and stuff like that. Yeah.
Your work is just interesting on so many different levels.
I
so
agree.
much.
Very complex, actually. Yeah, multi-layered. Yeah. There was another question, right?
Yeah, Zahid can go now.
Go ahead. Zahid.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. Someone has problems. This was actually meant to sort of be a springboard off Aaron's earlier comment, especially with respect to the idea of the loss of practices like basket weaving in terms of essentially what I think is a perception of the economic impossibility of this kind of practice, that it has been outmoded. You know, really in terms of like, if we look at the history, right, of the development of capitalism, I mean, there's the whole movement among the Luddites, you know, people that were still practicing sort of traditional, you know, loom-based weaving that, you know, ultimately reacted, you know, very outwardly to this this socialization of labor that, you know, essentially reduced everyone to just sort of, you know, unskilled laborers, valued unskilled labor, and you know, basically made people that, you know, practice the traditional sort of method, you know, economically unable to sustain themselves, right? And so what I really want to get at, I guess, to sort of address your project more specifically, I think that there is a sense in which this kind of practice has been lost, you know, not just because of sort of a problem with transmission, you know, or an interest sort of, you know, multi-generationally, but, you know, really because of the fact that ultimately in an environment where all production is commodified, an environment where ultimately people produce things like baskets, you know, as a form of wage labor, and, you know, are unable to sort of, you know, meet the profit-based interests of the owners of labor, I mean, the buyers of labor power without using machinery, without, you know, essentially just mass producing things. It's really, we live in, you know, an environment where this is not this is not feasible at a structural level, a systematic level. And so I guess what I want to say is, I think that it's interesting then to look at the sort of like your pessimismal piece, for example, as a reaction to this kind of impossibility, as you know, an expression of the idea that really in this kind of environment, actually all we can do almost is to sort of draw attention to this fact that the more radical move is not to sort of resurrect some putative tradition, but to comment on some real structural loss of the ability to access these kinds of practices because they're not, you know, permissible within the capitalist structure.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with the comments that you made. I think it was really interesting when I started researching these baskets and stuff like that, especially learning it online. It was actually kind of hard to find a lot of like basketry videos and stuff. It would seem like a kind of a craft practice that's not very like accessible. And even finding the reed was difficult as well. Like I kind of bought my reed from Walmart. So like, there we go. Like you can just see that like there's not that many places where you can get these traditional like materials. And when I started actually basket weaving and making these baskets, it took a while for me to learn. Like it took me like a month or two to really get the weaving down and get the whole structure to be made. And when I look at baskets at like Michael's, like the craft store, or like, you just go to Dollarama and you see these baskets are like super, super cheap. You're just like, how does that equate it? Because with baskets, actually, they're not machine made. Like you have to make it by hand. So that's why I was just like, these prices and like the labor that goes with it is just like, it doesn't really make that much sense to me. And it's just like, I guess it's abusive labor. I don't know, but it's just, yeah, when I just saw that, it was so jarring to me. Yeah.
I have a comment and question with regard to what you were just talking about. I think the basket traditionally weaved, the use of it has not disappeared or has not been replaced by something else. We still use a lot of basket, but material has been replaced with a plastic, and it's mass producible. Thus, it slowly make the traditional hand weaving kind of disappear because again, costs and production doesn't meet that way. But I think many of us maybe understand and agree that in many of the Asian households, because of noodle need to be, there's a lot of not just metal things, but we use a lot of plastic colanders, for instance, which is equivalent to the traditional bamboo baskets. Because one of my artists, Choi Jung-hwa, is using a lot of those mass-produced plastic colander as a part of material. And I also disagree with you about, is it the $1 Dalai Lama? Do they sell actually?
I meant to just basic cycles because I saw plastic. I don't think I think it's just like a mass.
I think they're all plastic. Yeah, they're all plastic. I've never seen
some like wooden twine ones, but they're still really cheap. They're like $4. But I'm pretty sure those like twine baskets are made out of wood. You can't make that in a factory. Like you gotta have to do it by hand. So that's why I'm just like, why are these so cheap? Like I don't really understand that.
Foreign labor in other countries, yes.
Yeah, probably.
Interesting points of foreign labor and exchange values and etc. Yes, very good points. Yeah, and while I was also want to add, because you definitely have some found object here, which you can really like expand on as a part, as in evolving art practices in the context of sculpture, installation, and any other context. But in the basket itself, it's very different from, let's say, if there's a plastic colander, it's not malleable. But what I like about all my basket that I purchased from actually the garage sale, because people seemingly abandon them because it attracts cockroaches in their household. Sorry about my personal story, but anyways, I have a lot of basket because it gives a warmth in your interior space. So I own them a lot. And then, but it's kind of malleable, you can kind of mold it in a certain way. So I found that actually particular household item that I love, basket, is fascinating, but you just echoed in your sculpture practices, you purchased it, you molded it in a certain way. So that echoes that aspect of fascinating malleability of this found object. Just want to say comments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we also have a comment in the chat box from Mael Belek. The Lingnan School founders were trying to rejuvenate Chinese culture by using a new style, at least new in China. And later in the 1920s, they defined this style as something traditional. I like the way your work reminds us that there is no clear-cut difference between something new and contemporary and tradition. It's in line with the history of the Lingnan School. Thank you.
Very interesting comment. Kristi, do you have the response to that? In fact, wasn't it through my class that I taught the Lingnan School? Lingnan School with the traditional landscape painting with the airplanes and yeah.
Yeah, I think the Lingnan school is really interesting because, yeah, my great-grandfather was part of that school as well, and he was studying under a master in that school. I can't really remember his name, but yeah, I think it was really interesting that they were using sort of Western perspective or viewpoints to do like landscape paintings. And I was just really, I just thought it was very interesting because during the time of when the Lingnan style school was happening, it was like during the time of a lot of like, there was like colonization happening in Hong Kong, and then there was like, you know, there was like, well, my great grandfather lived through like World War I and World War II, and I think he was, I think when I read in his bio, he also did some like expos in Belgium as well. Like he went to Belgium to do like a Chinese exhibition expo, and I thought maybe that would have been like an influence of why like maybe they're doing the Western, a little bit of a Western influence in that type of painting because they're doing a lot of expos in Europe. So they're trying to maybe introduce that sort of like painting to maybe make it more palatable for Westerners. I'm just having these assumptions. So that's why I was just like, yeah, this is a really interesting style of painting. And I thought my collaboration would be kind of interesting to add on top of that. Maybe not as a contemporary way, but to add to the narrative of maybe the schooling. I don't know.
Niall, are you you are an expert of Chinese arts. Can you say a few more words and your reaction to this comment? That what do you mean by the no clear cuts between new and tradition? How do you render that in relation to your understanding of Lingnan School?
The Lingnan School, what I find funny in this school is that, of course, when they started, they borrowed most of what they did from Japan, in fact. That's where they were taught, and that's what they brought back from Japan to China. And it was new in China, and it was innovative, and that was a way for them to rejuvenate Chinese tradition and Chinese art. But from the end of the 20s onward, being heavily influenced by Japan became a problem for them because, of course, the political situation was not perfect for them at that time. And what is very funny is that the founder of the school, Gao Jianfu, at that time, he said, of course, we were influenced by Japan, but what we brought back from Japan was Chinese painting. And he wrote a text whose title is something like Japanese painting is in fact Chinese painting. And this innovative style was defined as something traditional 20 years later when they needed to fit into Chinese tradition. And that's what I find funny. That's this way to see something contemporary and to turn it into a tradition. And you can do, of course, you can try to process tradition into doing something, into turning it into something new. And that's what's the meaning of my comment.
All right, wonderful. Thanks a lot. Yes, once mistaken as a Western indeed was part of our culture also. Those a lot of
to add something to that because the flag in the pole painting, my great grandfather who painted that, it was actually inspired by a Japanese painting. So you're on that part. Yeah, so yeah, I think with the Lingnan style, they did have a lot of references from some Japanese painters, and some of the painters would go to Japan and come back to study techniques from them as well.
But then that Japanese here, talking about the Japanese who actually tried to innovate their own their traditional painting through Western perspective, also Western kind of cultural heritage. So there's layers of transcultural actually influences here we're talking about. So it is relevant comments actually, right? Where's the boundary and who influenced what, right? So anyway, that's interesting. Thank you very much. Is there other comments or any, are we ready to move on or Coordinator, tell us, should we move on or we can invite more conversation?
Yes, let's be moving on.
All right, thanks a lot, Kristi. That was amazing. I will talk to you personally more about what I found also amazing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Soyan.
Thank you. Let's invite the next speaker, Zahid Daudjee. Again, you gonna correct your name and pronounce it properly for all of us. Zahid is a PhD student in Department of East Asian Studies, Princeton University, US. And he is currently located in Toronto because pandemic means we do online schools. Yep, and the title of the presentation is Invented Traditions, Nationalism and the Rhetoric of Orthodox Chinese Characters in Post-Colonial Taiwan. So he's going to talk about language issue. Thanks a lot. Jade, are you ready to share your screen?
Yeah, sure, yeah. So, actually, Miles' comment was a very good segue into my presentation in drawing attention to the sort of blurring of boundaries between ideas of tradition, contemporaneity, and innovation. So I'll present sort of a brief introduction to the context in which this project was conceived. Well, first of all, my name is Zahid Daudjee. I'm, as Professor Park said, I'm a first-year PhD student at Princeton University. But I actually used to specialize, I currently specialize in Japanese literature. I used to specialize in Taiwanese history. So this project actually emerged out of an exchange year that I spent in Taiwan. And interestingly, it sort of came out of this an awareness of a social problem I observed as far as a kind of cultural essentialism that was prominent, that had a place in sort of the discourse in, you know, educational institutions. Certainly in terms of the government propaganda that, I mean, you really sort of just get inundated with as a foreigner who is, you know, meant to experience some sort of idealized conception of what Taiwan is. But what I noticed is that there was a sort of tendency to discriminate against Chinese mainlanders on the grounds of this putative idea of a loss of culture, of a failure to preserve something that, you know, many people I met claimed Taiwan had preserved sort of, you know, unadulterated perfectly. And this was sort of problematic for me because I felt that this was producing a kind of, you know, ethnocultural essentialism that was ultimately making it difficult to have productive engagements between sort of mainland Chinese people and Taiwanese people. And so I kind of came to this project. So this is more or less an abbreviated version of my master's thesis that I produced at the University of Toronto. So without further ado, I'll begin. So I'd like to begin with this pamphlet. Basically, this pamphlet is something I came across in the University of Toronto East Asian Library. And it's part of a larger series entitled Traditional Chinese Culture in Taiwan. There are various sort of inclusions, you know, spanning from questions of traditional clothing or food to, you know, the written languages we see here. But I'd like to focus on a particular quote that emerges here as the center of a larger problematic. So I'll just read this out loud. This is there's a slight omission in the middle, but the quote encompasses everything I really want to address. So although Chinese characters may appear to be quite complicated, they cannot be randomly simplified. An increasing number of people from all corners of the globe are coming to Taiwan's various Mandarin training centers to study the Chinese language in its original form. So this is interesting on two accounts. On the one hand, we should really understand this reference to the idea of random simplification as a kind of attack on the script of simplified characters that is used presently in China, the People's Republic of China. And this idea of an original form points to this idea of a sort of, you know, pure, perfect, essentialized, you know, point of provenance for Chinese characters in general. Now, naturally, we should understand this, the pamphlet is entitled Written Language, should understand this as referring specifically to the question of Chinese writing. I don't presume that the Taiwanese government is making claims about the longevity of Mandarin. Certainly those would be very easy to address in terms of the very short history of Mandarin as a sort of national language with that was essentially isomorphic with the borders of a Chinese state. But there's certainly claims being made here. On the one hand, there's a claim that there's essentially an undermining of the authority of the script that's being used in China. On the other hand, there is a sort of, you know, a claim for legitimacy on the part of the Taiwanese state. So in order to really, you know, address this, to understand what needs to be unpacked here, I think we can kind of center our dialogue on three main questions. So on the first account, who is it that really is able to define the terms like Orthodox traditional? Who has the authority to say what counts as tradition, what can be orthodoxy, and what is not? Second, what does it really mean for a Chinese character or, you know, the Chinese writing system to be, you know, as practiced in particular place, to be orthodox? again, this is kind of a definitional question, but as we'll see, I'll provide a brief history of the evolution of Chinese characters. We'll see that the idea of orthodoxy, sort of just even as a term in itself, without even considering the referent, has a certain problematicity to it. And finally, to really unpack the sort of political nature of these ideas and to understand the claims as a bid for legitimacy tied directly to the nation state, I think we should understand, we should question what the political purpose is to saying and writing system is orthodox. So proceeding from this premise, I'm just going to provide a very brief history of Chinese characters. There's obviously, it's a huge field to focus in its own right, called 文字学 in Chinese. And I actually studied this at National Taiwan University, so there's much more than I can get to in this presentation. But essentially, we should proceed from the understanding that Chinese characters as a systematized whole have existed at least since the end of the Shang Dynasty. So we're talking roughly a 2,000-year history. I say as a systematized whole, because Chinese characters certainly would have had to have existed before this. When people say that Chinese characters have existed since the late Shang Dynasty, they're actually referring to oracle bone characters, which were used for divination. They were inscribed in the backs of turtle bones, basically, and they were essentially, used for the purpose of, kings trying to foretell the future, stuff like that. But at this point, there was already a complete enough system that these characters could actually be understood as constituting sort of language, that they could express essentially linguistic statements, which is one of the essential conditions for something being a writing system, as opposed to just, sort of a set of arbitrary symbols. So we know that there's at least a 3,000-year history there. And in various stages, and this does not mean these were not mutually exclusive stages, but in various stages, Chinese characters developed as the media for writing changed. So originally, there, as I explained, there's writing on, for example, turtle bones, but there's also writing, in terms of ceremonial inscriptions on the kinds of, I guess we could call them pots. There are a lot of specialized terms, but bronzeware, I guess, that was used for ancestral worship, things like that. And then ultimately there was writing on bamboo strips and, engraving in stone, and the sort of more recent incarnation of, writing on paper. But the point is that Chinese script went through sort of several different incarnations, which ultimately actually were cumulative, did not replace each other. And these are usually expressed as seal script, clerical script, standard script, running script, and cursive script. So I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but if you look at the right of the screen, there's actually there's a snapshot of something that I will discuss in a little bit more detail later, a proposal for simplified characters that emerged in 1950s Taiwan. And it doesn't include all of the categories I listed there, but it provides a good sort of survey of the way the Chinese characters have changed over time. And so the point that I really want to emphasize here is that for much of Chinese history, these different scripts have coexisted. And there's obviously a kind of difficulty in comparing different standards there. And I mean, these were all at some point or other, used in an official capacity. They did end up being standardized in some way. So we should understand that even the idea of one hegemonic standard is not really a useful way to understand the history of Chinese characters. But the best statement that really sums it up is this quote here by handling this history of the Chinese writing system. He says, despite the common perception that Chinese writing has remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, the Chinese script has always been characterized by a high degree of variation. Character forms have not been constant over time and space. And while the lexicographic tradition within China has attempted to distinguish formally correct variants from popular forms, in practice, these distinctions have not been maintained within the manuscript, printing, and handwriting cultures. So what we should understand is that, because in approaching the problem of orthodoxy, we need to understand, as I said before, where it comes from and what it really means. Orthodoxy has never been really a hegemonic concept. It's never actually been able to exercise absolute control over sort of the graphical space of Chinese writing. Individual authors, calligraphers have always used their own variant forms, and this is essential to any understanding of the context, the literary sort of graphemic ecosystem in which Chinese writing took place. So now we come to the problem specifically of Taiwan's formulation of Orthodox characters. So we should remember here that when I say Orthodox characters, I'm using a translation of a term actually. So the original term in Chinese is 正体字, and this is not, it's important to know the term that's used in the mainland. This is a term that is used by the Taiwanese government, the Republic of China. Historically, it's had other uses, certainly. It's not a term that has never existed, but it's always been in a sense a loaded term. First of all, we need sort of theoretical analysis of the concept of orthodoxy. Now, orthodoxy understood really in any particular realm, has to exist in opposition to something else. It can't, there can be no orthodoxy unless there is a prevailing environment of heterodoxy. So whether we take, say, the example of an Orthodox church, Orthodox practices, there's a pretense of preserving something on the one hand. On the other hand, there's an idea of a particular practice has been sanctioned and exists within a space where practices have sort of produced a varied ecosystem where they've diverged in some sense or other. So to really dig deep into the question of orthodoxy, we need to understand how Orthodox characters are enumerated. You know, what are these Orthodox characters relative to the larger sort of space of Chinese characters? And so in truth, actually, Orthodox characters, this term has been used across different eras in Chinese history. Certainly the term has appeared in different forms, not necessarily with that formulation I showed you before, 正体字. Sometimes it's appeared as 正字. Later in literature, we see 正海字, which is, so the 正字is just correct characters without the middle character that means sort of style or system, and 正海is like standard, essentially standard script, so standard and Orthodox characters. But these all point to something of the same idea. And the point is that this sort of, the signifier has persisted across different eras. But the signifier persisting does not mean that signifiers remain the same. So there have been different ideas of what Orthodox characters really are. And these standards have generally been established by dictionaries. So within philological capacity, historically, a lot of people would look to this ancient Chinese dictionary that, you know, until fairly recently was central to studies of the history of Chinese characters, called the 说文解字. There's no really good translation I can provide for that. It's just, you can take it as a name. It means to explain wen, which is an old form of progenitor of Chinese characters, and to understand or to sort of unpack zi, which are characters. Though they meant something a little bit different back then. But basically, that original dictionary was the standard for a long period of time, and was in a sense sort of overrun, or perhaps its use was usurped by later imperial dictionaries, or we might say character dictionaries that were meant for people to study for the imperial examinations. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this idea that the imperial examination system was a major sort of agent of social economic mobility historically in China. People, in order to write the exams, would have to make reference to these dictionaries because they would be judged on their use of sort of an ordained standard. But the point is that these are all different dictionaries, so it can't possibly be the same set of characters. So to understand this, specifically in the context of Taiwan, which, you know, is again yet another incarnation, we should look at the ways in which the term has been used sort of in its historical specificity. So before the 1970s, really, Orthodox characters in Taiwan did not have a sort of recently, you know, kind of carefully enumerated standard which they can make reference to. They made reference essentially on the one end to the imperial dictionaries I discussed before that were used for the imperial examinations. On the other hand, the very famous Kangxi dictionary of 1716. But as one might know, this is naturally a standard that, you know, comes before even the development of the Taiwanese state after the Chinese Civil War, which must be understood, you know, as a very specific historical construct coming after the Japanese surrender in World War II. The Taiwanese state had never sort of existed, you know, certainly in an independent sense for that. And as Japan left, some people argued actually that the new government that came in after it lost the Chinese Civil War and established itself was actually occupying force. But in any case, in 1973, the Taiwanese government finally moved to standardize these characters. So it actually it commissioned this university, a university of relatively high stature in Taiwan, to take its graduate department in Chinese philology and produce a specific standard that could be made reference to later on. And so there's a problem here, of course. We see a clear divide, right? Before the 1970s, there were these historical standards that were used that were sort of just de facto standards. They weren't, you know, they were understood to constitute the body of Orthodox characters, but you know, there was no sort of, you know, new official list, and then finally a new official list was made. So, you know, why? Now, to understand this, we need to look at the history of simplification and within the government actually that constitute the modern Taiwanese state. So I'll try not to get too technical here, but there's a little bit of sort of terminology required. So the government at that time that ended up taking over in Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War was called the Kuomintang, or people refer to it as the KMT for short. And actually in 1935, they promulgated their own script standard. So they developed something that corresponds to the modern title of simplified characters in mainland China and the PRC, but it was unsuccessful because there was a lot of opposition within the party, and ultimately the standard was dropped. So it wasn't actually fully implemented, even though the proposal was really a fairly exhaustive proposal. If you look at it in detail, you see that there were provisions for how it would be implemented in terms of education, in terms of adherence of major media institutions, to the new set. So contrary to the rhetoric of the Taiwanese state, and this is an important point, actually simplification was initiated first by this very same government that ended up deriding it. In any case, sorry, I saw in the chat. All right. Sorry, I'll try to hurry up a little bit. So I'd like to look at this this process from the point of view of the history of the 1950s. There were various voices that became pertinent at this time, but one of the most sort of recognizable perhaps is a man named Luo Jialun. And so what Mr. Luo did is he voiced sort of repeatedly and very articulately a set of proposals for the adoption of simplified characters. But what's really interesting is the language in which he develops this concept. So what he argues is that actually simplified characters are not some sort of novel constitution. They're not, they're not something that was not present in society before, or that must be created or invented, but rather they exist abundantly in certain institutions. They're used by the army, they're used within official documents, and they're also present among what have kind of come de facto to be recognized as Orthodox characters. So if you look at on the right, the characters that appear above the line are the characters that were simplifications of older forms. And the characters that appear below the line are characters that were sort of, historical precursors. So the title says characters that were sort of long ago simplified, but are now recognized Orthodox characters. So he has quite a bit of detail in his proposal. There are a few sort of other quick graphics here. On the left, you see characters within the purple rectangles that were used in official documents. Just visually, it's very easy to see that they have fewer strokes, the characters corresponding below the lines. And on the right, we see characters that correspond to even the modern simplified standards in many cases of the People's Republic of China, but ultimately are, in a sense, they're simplified with respect to precursors, but again, they had great currency in society. So the point that he's making is that this idea of an economy is already problematic. And what's interesting is actually sort of with this proposal and with recognition of the imperative, Luo Jialun was actually supported well by the government. So the title of the proposal I just showed you with the little snapshots in Chinese was 简体自治提倡顺为必要. And so what this means is, what I translate here is advocacy for simplified characters is of the utmost importance. And this is actually a quote from Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the sort of the military government of the KMT that did move to Taiwan later. So as far as anyone should be concerned, it was very clear that the directionality of character simplification of attitudes towards the Chinese writing system in Taiwan was one of support for simplification. But the really sort of instrumental radical shifts came in 1956 when the People's Republic of China promulgated a complete simplification standard that was meant to be fully implemented. In Taiwan, this hadn't been fully played out yet. It hadn't been sort of ratified by the government, whereas in China it had. And at this point, we see a very profound shift in attitudes. So the very same year, a few months later, the Taiwanese government, so the KMT, actually issued a new mandate saying, actually, you can't use simplified characters in homework in school anymore. You have to use Orthodox characters, and you also have to write vertically, right to left, unless you're writing something in a scientific publication, and don't use Western punctuation, basically. And so we see this sudden recourse to a kind of Chinese essentialism, right? This rejection, on the one hand, of sort of the policies of People's Republic of China as a state, and on the other hand, a sort of almost a recourse to Chinese cultural essentialism. And accompanying this, this is a little bit later, but I mean, this was the beginning of a series of movements. And in 1978, a man named Chen Lifu, who was affiliated with the military prior, he decided to develop a book that was meant to sort of produce a script that was in practice, simplified in some sense, certainly in terms of the connections of strokes meant to be written faster, but the rhetoric that he used to describe this book actually suggested that it was just equivalent to cursive handwriting like you see in the West in English. So he was basically saying, of course, and he says it actually in his introduction to the book, of course, every nation has a cursive script and it has, a print sort of, a standard script. And he says this is only natural. So by rewriting the discourse and essentially positing anything outside of the space of Orthodox characters, which was now kind of becoming an increasingly low term, getting additional political meaning, he argued that anything outside the space of Orthodox characters could only be a sort of shorthand, could be something used, perhaps in one's spare time and personal note taking. So he denied the possibility of an official status being afforded to simplified characters, thereby undermining the legitimacy of the PRC, the Chinese government's claim to establish the simplified character set as a new and legitimate representation of the Chinese people or the Chinese language. And in 1979, the Ministry of Education, following the recommendation of National Taiwan Normal University, published a list of about 4,808 common use characters, shortly followed up by additional addenda and also a 1984 list of variant characters, which clearly established a dichotomy because there was all of a sudden a crisis, right? With the establishment of simplified standard and this sudden sort of bifurcation within the Chinese script world, it suddenly became important to sort of create an inside and an outside. And so the inside would be these common use characters that actually within this list, and in government rhetoric, they still use the term Orthodox characters, but within this list, they were simply referred to as common use characters. And so there was this sort of establishment of Taiwan as setting the standard, and it was no longer possible to retain a de facto standard because the politicization of the script had reached that level. But what this really allowed in the future use of the term Orthodox characters, which is still in common use today in Taiwan, is that kind of a sort of sleight of hand in which something that was in fact an invention, the product of research, a very recent product, as we can see from the 70s era research developments, was allowed to sort of masquerade as something that had always existed, that had been this sort of perpetual inclusion in the history of Chinese characters that was originary, that was unadulterated. And so if there's a few main points that I really want to sort of hammer in with this presentation, they can kind of be summarized among the first three that you see here. One, Orthodox characters are not, first of all, they don't have a consistent reference. But second, they're not really necessarily older or more authentic or more legitimate. There has always been a sort of history of variation in the Chinese script world, and ultimately, the only thing that's remained consistent across time is the label Orthodox characters, which is always pointing to something different depending on the particular purposes of whatever government instrumentalized that label. And second, simplified characters are not some sort of iconoclastic modern invention. Simplified characters are in some sense equally a label. They don't always point to the same idea, but they have, in the sense of just the literal sense of reduction of strokes, perhaps, simplified characters have actually always existed, in as far back even as 200 AD in Chinese history. And so what all this points to is this third point, that the idea of tradition is essentially a very political, very loaded term. It's often instrumentalized by the nation state in order to construct a history, to construct an idea of what produces of a source of legitimacy to which people might have access that can be used to meet particular sort of geopolitical ends. So just in the Taiwanese context, I would posit this claim that within a situation where Taiwan did not receive widespread recognition as a state, it was essentially reliant on a bid for a kind of essentialized traditional Chineseness. And it was because the UN actually, for example, recognized Taiwan first as a legitimate government and only recognized the People's Republic of China later. ultimately, it was best able to articulate its claims to statehood in terms of the essentialist Chineseness, thus the rhetoric of traditionalism and orthodoxy. So yeah, that's it. Sorry, that was a little bit long, but thank you everyone for listening. If I know there's a lot of technical language in this presentation, so if anyone needs any elaboration, please feel free to ask. My master's thesis was very technical too, so it comes out somewhere or other.
That was actually very engaging unpacking of, cultural essentialism. Actually, the critique of linguistic essentialism is the way I actually understood, which played out in the politics and politicizing of languages in relation to nationalism, which is not all good, not all bad, but interesting. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. That maybe a lot of questions. And anyone please, anyone has any questions, raise your hands or write a comment. Aaron has a question. Aaron, go ahead. Yes.
I'm always going first. No, I'm just I've heard this kind of before, but I'm also wondering, how does all of this, the 正体字, as well as in Cantonese we sometimes call it 书面语, meaning the characters written on a page instead of what we say. So how does speech pertain to all of this? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with how anything is being said. And one of the reasons why Hong Kong and Macau are quite keen on continuing to use traditional languages, because some of the words that you can say, you can only write out there's only one way to write it. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on that.
So the question of the relationship between speech and writing is a very interesting one. And I mean, there's, in a sense, it would be difficult to sort of address it fully without referring to sort of theoreticians outside the scope of this presentation. But I guess just look specifically at the Cantonese context or the Hong Kongese context. It's interesting because ultimately, you know, there is a kind of diglossia that is especially well manifested, I think, in the sphere of writing, right? The fact that there is, as I understand it, a practice of people reading what is essentially a vernacular Mandarin transformed into scripts, you know, in native Cantonese readings, right? So taking what is grammatically equivalent and essentially derivative, actually, of Mandarin and you know, just normally, like I've heard that, and I can't speak to this in great detail because my knowledge of Cantonese is limited, but you know, people like newscasters will sometimes, you know, read things out like that using essentially, you know, Mandarin grammar. And so the problem is sort of exacerbated in that sense, in that also like there's I think this is a very intentional act, but there's a twinning often of this sort of, you know, bid for a representation of a language that does, you know, I think that many people feel is being eroded. You know, the vernacular Cantonese in writing, and an argument that, you know, essentially without the use of these characters, this kind of representation is impossible. And I think it's very interesting. I think a lot of dialogue about this sort of is manipulated somehow. We don't get the whole picture. My understanding, and I can't again speak to all the specificities of Cantonese, but my understanding is that much like in the case of the Minnan language in Taiwan, because historically a lot of writing was done in the classical language or some sort of variant of classical language, aside from things like, you know, popular operas. Actually, a lot of these sort of, you know, so-called sort of unique characters, you know, meant for use in Cantonese or, you know, in Minnan or whatever, are coinages, or they're attempts at reconstruction that ultimately can't perfectly access a history that, you know, we don't have necessarily written records of. So there's a kind of, you know, and again, a kind of invention of tradition in the sense of, you know, on the one hand, I mean, so I certainly agree with the impetus to try to preserve and to create a space, I think, for written Cantonese. I think this is you know, commendable. But on the other hand, there's a sort of you know, manipulation of this idea, because on the one hand, Hong Kong uses traditional characters, and so anything that is coined within the space of Hong Kong to write Cantonese can be seen as somehow essentially immutable. It must exist in this form, right? It was coined there. It was, you know, made to represent the language by people living in Hong Kong, and therefore anything else would be a sort of, a quasi-colonial imposition, right, or a sort of reduction or whatever. And so I think that, yeah, it's created a very interesting sort of a possibility for a defense of fictional characters that can be somewhat dishonest, but has a sort of utilitarian purpose. Yeah.
Sorry, so young you can go.
Oh no, Aaron, if you wanna come back and just one more turn, and yeah.
No, I'll come back later.
I have a clarifying question, because this is like kind of area that I am, deficient of factual information, because I had a lot of Chinese friends, but I never really inquired, do you use the classical Chinese? And then I just learned that Hong Kong Chinese use classical Chinese characters still. Is it factual information, which I didn't know, because I thought of simplified Chinese. The simplified Chinese is only used in mainland China. Anyone can confirm then? Who can confirm this one? Okay,
I can actually.
You're invited as experts. So Zahid, is it simplified Chinese? Is it used only? There are multiple Chinese-speaking countries, right? And Cantonese and Mandarin as the representative spoken Chinese. But in terms of character, simplified Chinese is only used in mainland China. Is it correct, true, or false?
So it's actually used in Singapore as well, and I'm sure that there are diaspora communities, that constitute more recent immigrations that would use simplified Chinese. There's a sort of, the divide is generally as follows, and keep in mind that even when labels are homogenized, they don't always refer to the exact same character set, but usually so-called traditional characters, which refers to the same thing as the Orthodox characters I discussed in this presentation. They're seen as being used by essentially Chinatowns in North America, by Hong Kong, by Taiwan. And I think probably to some extent, I wouldn't know the full details, but probably by some diaspora communities in sort of, Polynesia and Australasia more generally. But Singapore as a state formally made a decision to adopt simplified Chinese characters. I think something in the last 30, 40 years. I couldn't give you an exact date on that, but so Singapore does, but they're the only nation that is not China that use simplified characters, and they're a city state. So there's, a politics of sort of association there. That's important.
And do you think that Singaporean choice is something political, or is it practical? Because I do believe, if I'm wrong, correct me. I think it is generally acceptable truth that classical Chinese is very difficult to write, and in fact, it is very non-economic in terms of the modern life. Less is more, and so the early reformists from 20th century is just to increase the literacy over Chinese characters, so to modernize the politics and everything. And so there was a good reason, egalitarian reason for that. So it's just Singaporean choice of it. It also somewhat echoes those modernizing egalitarian causes, or is it something that they want to show alliance with the mainland China for political reason? What do you see? Is it practical or political?
To speak in detail of the Singaporean case is a little bit difficult because I haven't personally studied it. But if you want sort of my 2 cents, I believe that it's a political choice. I don't deny the sort of historical imperative that you bring up as far as because I mean, if we're just, because the historicity of this is important. The roots of the movement that ultimately led simplified Chinese characters, did come in terms of the May 4th movement, in terms of a group of leftist intellectuals that ultimately were critical in founding the Communist Party in China. However, I mean, I think certainly, and this is a subject open for debate, and I don't, surmise to, be able to, produce an extensive, exhaustive discussion here. But basically, there is a lot of literature that suggests that the writing system you use is not incredibly, it will not have a concrete sort of deterministic bearing on literacy or people's engagement so much as the sort of infrastructure of education. So, and we work in a computer age now, right? So, I mean, a lot of people don't even handwrite characters. And so in that sense, what is actually important is sort of the construction of input systems. I mean, there are a lot of other factors, naturally, to learning. I personally would argue that the most important question is that of how people are exposed and the attitude of the government. For example, in Japan, there is an attitude that Chinese characters are difficult. This is a sort of, a common element, I might say, of a lot of governing bodies that, just without really looking at the research, would say these are difficult, so we're going to teach them later. But so I think this produces the effect that a lot of Japanese people grew up with this idea, take it as a truism, and ultimately are not as fluent in sort of using the entire body of Chinese characters as early as they might otherwise be, because access to this environment, everyday exposure, is withheld by an educational apparatus that decided already that these are too difficult and therefore it doesn't try to teach them. So I think that in the modern context, we can't really say that. I mean, there are other factors, but so in Singapore, I think it's political in the sense that I think that there is a lot of incentive to associate oneself with a regional power that is, ascending to an almost hegemonic status. I mean, China, and this is purely a commentary on the state. This is not a critique of, individuals, not a commentary on the Chinese population at large. Everyone has their own views on the script, but there's power in being associated with China. There's power in having access to that, and there's a power of being able to draw in kind of immigration, right? So I think that these are all important factors, but I don't claim to be a historian in Singapore, so that's just my guess.
Thanks a lot. And anyone? We can come back. Yeah.
Can I add to So-Young's question about the Chinese characters traditional being more difficult? It's more difficult to write just because there are more strokes, right? It doesn't make it more difficult to read, and well, maybe that's because
more to read too. Yeah, I am a witness to it. I learned classical Chinese character, and I can tell you, I can testify, it is more difficult when there's more strokes.
But also on the point of input method and technology, when I type Chinese, I use how it sounds to find the character, and then I select it, right? So going back to the question of the speech and vernacular, how that actually, it's interesting that all of the Taiwanese discourse about whether they're the original or not has nothing to do at all with how the words are actually spoken. I mean, there's a manner in which they speak it, or there's a mannerism attached to their form of Mandarin. But I'm just curious as to how what's the relationship with that, and in terms of like the input of it to technology.
I see. If this is meant as a sort of clarification of your earlier question, I think I see a little bit better what you're getting at now. I'm sorry if I didn't answer the first question as directly as I could have. Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? And I tried to allude to this problem when I spoke of sort of the fact that in the pamphlet I showed my presentation, I couldn't really possibly be speaking about the spoken language because sort of, to speak of Mandarin is a whole other kind of worms. And so that is, in a sense, perhaps the problem. I mean, so the standard of Mandarin in Taiwan is based loosely on, I mean, if there was absolute governmental control, it would be sort of an exact simulacrum of the Nanjing Standard Mandarin used during the Republican era between 1911 and, well, I mean, it's conveniently demarcated, the end is 1949, but the Republic continues in Taiwan, right? But ultimately there was a sort of intrusion, very inexpedient for state propaganda of a kind of, topolexical accent, right, from Minnan, among other languages in Taiwan. And so their speech actually is often sort of, the accusation of being non-standard is often leveled at it, right? And I mean, I think because that's so transparent, a sort of topolexical affectation, which I don't, I'm not trying to argue that this is a bad thing. There's not, the sort of rhetoric of standardness has all kinds of problems, but it would be very difficult for them to lay claim to some sort of idea of the most original spoken Chineseness because of all kinds of problems in the history of the development of Mandarin as a national language and their particular sort of brand of Mandarin. I mean, ultimately Mandarin is, it came out of a lot of Manchurian influence, right, during the Qing dynasty. It has a lot of sounds that historical Chinese topolex did not have, and really could be sort of located as developing primarily in the northeastern region of China. So I mean, it's very difficult for them to lay claim to that, right? How can they have the most original version of Mandarin when that's northeastern China? So they have to use script, they have to use writing. That's the only way they have access to that kind of claim, right?
But Maari has a question, and I have a quick comment if I have chance. Yeah, Maari.
Yeah, sorry. So hi. I'm really interested in like Chinese characters and classical Chinese, even though like I've never learned it per se. I don't know, like I really like the way Chinese and like especially classical Chinese has this has created this whole written system in which it really represents like an imagery, right? It represents ideas, shapes, and movement, and all this is just like it became characters, kind of. And so I learned Japanese, and I know that it has always helped me so much when my teachers used to, and even now actually, explain the imagery behind a character. It always helped me remember it and apply it to, life in general. So now I remember that, for example, this character is used in this context, like because it's the shape of a hand or whatever, right? And I thought, isn't simplification of Chinese, like classical Chinese character, a double-edged sword in a way? Because if you simplify a character, it's true that it's going to be there are less strokes, so it may be easier to, like, faster to write and easier for people to remember it. But on the other hand, isn't it getting away further and further from the original, the original imagery of the character? And then isn't it losing its nature in a way and making it difficult for people to remember it because they forget the idea, the movement, the shape, the image, the real image behind it somehow? I don't know if it's very clear, but it's a question that I had in my mind.
I think it's what is your response? It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I guess I would say this, and this is, because people don't have very sort of deep knowledge of the evolution of the Chinese script often, it's there are a lot of assumptions, and I mean, these are assumptions that are not unique to sort of foreign learners, but assumptions that are often propagated within the education system about the way that Chinese characters work or the way that literacy works. And I don't mean to undermine certainly the idea that there is a real sort of imagerial aspect. Certainly, there are characters that exist in the modern language that are linearized. So in Chinese, the term they use in describing history is 线条化. So literally like the making of like the linification, right? But like it's linearization. But so that a lot of really pictorial things that have been maintained in the Chinese language ultimately have become sort of assemblages of lines. This is the nature of the script, and we can argue on the one hand that they have pictorial provenance, which is true. On the other hand, we could also argue that this is not necessarily immediately evident without these sort of stories that you make reference to, and so this is also an important sort of problem that it's not clear that the way that literacy functions is ultimately, I mean, it's one thing to develop mnemonic strategies as a learner and to make reference to them. It's another thing to, expect that native speakers upon encountering this character for the first time will actually be able to make that jump. And I mean, both are functions in the sense, and they apply to different sort of practices of literacy, different developments of literacy. But the more important point here, as just a point of clarification, is that the vast majority of Chinese characters are a combination of a sort of semantic component and a what we might call a phonetic component. So they point on the one hand to a kind of probable sound to read the character. On the other hand, they point to a general category of meaning. Some people argue that these categories have lost meaning because of transferences that have happened. Many characters, for example, like earlier coinages, were basically borrowing. So to put it simply, my Chinese philology professor at National Taiwan University said, inventing a character for, say, like the concept of a question word is hard. How do you invent that character? So he said, actually, what happened often was that something was borrowed. So in that case, for example, the character for lotus was actually originally the character that's now used for in Chinese is he. So it's used for various question words. It appears also in Japanese, but for different usages. But what happened is that when they did that, they had two different meanings for the same character. They had to go back and add a grass radical to the character that was originally used for lotus, so that they could disambiguate. So at that point, so the character we have now for lotus, was originally, I'm not really sure. I don't know if I can speak to the idea that it was a drawing originally, but it certainly it ended up sort of making reference to the idea of a lotus in a roundabout way by sort of adding after the fact, classification. And there are a lot more complicated cases. For example, like what are called traditional characters, like the character for lightning actually did not really originally look like. Actually, so the better example is the character for, so the character that is used for electricity now, right? So Yin, that didn't have the the like rain reticle at, you know, when it was originally conceived. That was actually a picture, but because it was it was seen as sort of maybe hard to unpack etymologically, they added the rain reticle later.
Yeah.
So what made it, even though it's used as the traditional, it's not the most original character. The most original character is a drawing of, you know, like lightning in a field, basically, like with the water, you know, splashing around and stuff that, you know, people didn't immediately get. So like the problem also of traditionality is then, like, because what is referred to when people talk about traditional characters is not even necessarily the original picture in some cases. Sometimes it's a picture plus additional other components.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's really a long way to, but you kind of, hopefully this gives you a better understanding of the sort of problems and understanding the way the Chinese script works in literacy.
Yeah. Thank you for taking the time to actually try to understand what I thought.
Interesting question and conversation. How are we doing with the time right now, coordinators?
Yep, we should move on from here.
Yeah. Interesting aesthetic assessment of Chinese character. We call it pictogrammatic languages, right? In terms of its origin and things. Yeah. So definitely has the beauty. And art and design students love Chinese character, by the way. They love to copy them. When I just use a few of them, they just love it. But Chinese character is not by left-wing scholar, but the reason why Korean used to use Chinese character, right, until 15th century. But King Sejong, I think Zahid knows this history. Reason why he invented Korean character alphabet system called Hangul, he's not left-wing, okay? He's not Marxist. He genuinely find that he's famously said is language for elite is too difficult for my poor people learn and capable of writing and reading. So therefore, let me invent Hangul, is what he says. So I just want to share that it is not just a left-wing ideological statement about being, you know, the language have an impediment to the increased literacy. And so anyways, lots of ideas, but thanks a lot for your contributions, for the amazingly enriching discussions. Thank you. Thank you, Zahid. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Max Chu, who actually was originally planned to speaking yesterday, but she had some issues. And so we moved her to today's discussion.